thought it would be a good idea to start with biography. The last time we talked, you said that your life before making movies was actually a lot more interesting than your life since making movies. So I think that's a really good way to start. Tell us about some of that.
Well, I think I had the great good fortune to grow up in a neighborhood called Roseland, which is the last neighborhood in Chicago before the Chicago River, and you're no longer in Chicago. So it's the last neighborhood on the south side. It was very interesting. I was watching some documentary about some cult in California the other evening, last week, and they were interviewing all these people who were cult members, because as always happens in cults, at first everything was so groovy and wonderful and and then of course it turns out the cult leader is a scumbag and he's doing every bad thing in the world. But they were interviewing the various people, and this one guy, young man on there, he goes, well, I came from the south side of Chicago and it was really violent. And I just went, yeah, it was, wasn't it? And like I say, today they have guns on the south side. We didn't have guns, but it was violent, always fighting and violence. It was just part of life, and I sort of think it was a great training ground for life in general.
Yeah. And you spent some time working in the carnival?
Well, that was much later. When I went to school, I worked for the Encyclopedia Britannica, and I actually had a suit and tie job, which nobody in the neighborhood did. And I went downtown and it didn't pay anything, And so the next year I went to work and I got a job in the steel mills for the summer job. And it was horrible, but it paid really well. And when I got out of college, I graduated. I went to University of Illinois, went to art school, and kind of left under a cloud, shall we say, and came back to Chicago. And went to Columbia College, which I really liked because the teachers were actually practitioners. So, the people that taught you TV production worked at a TV station. The people that taught you, cinematography shot commercials. But when I finally got out of school, there were no jobs, so I used my family connections, and I went to work at a tractor factory at 119th and Halsted, International Harvester, where my father had worked as a young man. My mother and her sisters worked during the war when women started working in the factories, and my grandfather worked there, and my uncle Archie worked there when I worked there, and that's how I got the job. So, other kids' families got them jobs in the TV stations or the movies or whatever. My family got me a job in a factory.
And then how did you find your way, to film eventually?
Well, I sort of knew it was where I wanted to get eventually, but I was a child of the 60s. And there was a famous song that I loved in those days, and the lyrics of the first verse went, "Don't want no war, don't want no war, don't want no war, don't want no job either." And it was like, I didn't want a career, I didn't want a job, I wanted an adventurous life. I was working in an advertising agency. I finally got, a job that my education led me to.
Yeah.
And I just hated the advertising business. It was just not for me in those days. And I had a pretty cool job in many ways, but I hated it. I just hated it. And there was a big conference room. There was a screening room with 35 millimeter projectors to show the commercials as they were being made. But when they had conference and they had presentations, we were on the other side of the glass, and we would project the slides, and we would project the films, and we would feed the sound, and we would do all the audiovisual support. And so even though I was just kind of a kid with a, entry-level position, I was privy to the top meetings that were going on in there because I had to service them. I remember one time they had the Dairy Queen account. And in the state of Texas, there was Dairy Queen and there was Texas Dairy Queen, because the campaigns for the rest of the country didn't work in Texas. They had to have separate advertising. And so they came up with this new thing, this new hamburger. It was like the Big Mac. It was a double meat patty, and it was called the Belt Buster. And I remember they're doing the presentation. They're going, look, we did this, and here we got this. We've been selling this double meat burger in Texas, and no one's buying them, So here's what we did: we new packaging and new this, and we subtracted cheese, and we charged a quarter. So the whole thing was, we give them less and we're charging them more, and everyone goes, "This is great," and I go, "That sucks." I just don't like this business. A lot of good people, a lot of smart people, a lot of very creative people. selling crap people didn't, need and charging them more than it was worth. I just didn't like it. Everything blew up. It was one of those times where life just blows up in your face. I split up with my wife. I had no, eventually ran out of money. I had no place to live. I went to stay with my parents for a while. My father threw me out in the street. We never got along. And I went to my best friend's house, and he was having an affair with a married woman, so I couldn't stay. And I wound up actually living in the bushes for an evening. I stayed at the bar. I was in Pullman. I stayed till the last bar closed, and then I had nowhere to go in the world. So I went to sleep in the bushes at the Greenstone Church, and woke up the next morning. Said, "This homeless shit ain't for me, man." And my friend Dave Crusoe, who grew up in Roseland also, but he grew up on 120th Street, which was the hillbilly street, and those were bad kids, man. And anyway, Dave, had been living in a national forest in Missouri as a hermit, basically. He built a little shelter out of 2x2s and visqueen, and was living anyway. But he ran into this group of people who had bought like 80 acres out and built their geodesic domes and their yurts, and but they were all carnies. And they took him in, and he started traveling with them. And then he was passing through Chicago, and he was heading for Davenport, Iowa, which is where the carnival started. And he said, "Hey, John, I'm going to the carnival in a couple of days. You want to come with me?" I go, "Yes." But I had a Canon 35 millimeter still camera. I had a plastic Kmart duffel bag. I had like 2 pairs of jeans, 4 pairs of socks, 4 pairs of underwear, and some t-shirts and a jacket. And I remember the man I would work for, his name was Frank Russell. And although I photographed the carnival extensively, I could never bring myself to photograph Frank. I thought my lens would break, because he was just like, whenever I think of Frank, I think of the word corruption just comes to the, he was an amazingly corrupt man. Anyway, I remember he was wearing this expensive leather sport jacket that couldn't cover his belly. He was walking up out like this, and Dave, I'm like, to me, it's like a job interview. I'm from, and Dave's, "Oh yeah, it's no problem." And I'm like nervous, and so he says, "Oh, there's Frank." We're walking down the Midway, and they're setting the whole thing up, and he goes, "Come on." And so I go and "Hey, Frank," and I goes, "Dave, what do you want?" "What?" He goes, "This is my friend John." He goes, "Yeah?" And he goes, "You got a job for him?" And he just goes, "Yeah." Just like that. That was it. I was a carny. So, and then the next year of my life was insane. Absolutely insane. So that was to me, that was the best showbiz education in the world. Because it's just like the movie business. You've got this portable city. Okay, what location we go? You go, you trucks, you unpack it, you set it up, you work for a week, you tear it down, you put it back in the truck, and you go to the... It's the same thing. Come here and give me your money, and I'll entertain you. I'll amuse you for a few minutes, and you'll give me your money. And that's the bargain. So not so different than the movie business.
Well, so in getting your start in the movie business, when
Still
Henry,
years to go.
still years to go, right? Your first film then is more of an assignment and not necessarily a dream project.
It was, but the assignment was so vague that it was like, make a horror film. That's it. That was the entire assignment. What should it be about? I don't care. I'll give you $100,000. I want a horror film. The rest is up to you. And it really spoiled me. And again, it sounds like an assignment, but it's so make a caper picture. Make a love story. Sure. I mean, it wasn't like, here's this lousy script and you got to go off and make. No, it's just like, here's $100,000. Make a horror film. You decide. So it was a complete. I preferred it to say do anything. As the I Ching said, unlimited choices are not suited to human beings. You need a box, and that was perfect.
Well, so before you got started making films, what kind of career did you envision for yourself, and is that any different from what's happened?
It's really hard to envision a career for yourself when you're so far physically distant from the real industry.
Yeah.
But I knew what kind of movies like I say, Henry, it always gets grouped into horror, but when I was a kid, I wasn't a huge horror fan. What I really was a fan of was film noir. Anything dark and dark and evil and all that kind of thing, but also social realism. was really more what appealed to me, and the method, those great method actors that were so real to the truth of life, rather than the grand, spectacle of Hollywood.
Well, I think it's fair to say that a number of your films definitely fit into a kind of ongoing noir tradition, but they're also not really of the 90s neo-noir, which are more focused on very particular kind of style and story tropes. And that kind of thing. But you've kind of worked a very different, much more straightforward kind of path. A little bit, feels a little bit to me more literary, like Patricia Highsmith and Jim Thompson, in terms of the attention to methodology and plotting, and the everyday being a part of the action.
Well, again, I grew up with criminals, and, and bad behavior, and as I say, I love Godard, but he was was a precursor of what people often accuse Tarantino of just being referential, and but that's a school of in art, also art that's reflecting on art, and it's completely valid to me, but some people paint from life, and some people paint about painting. I like to paint from life, not that the other is bad or wrong. I've hung out with people, people I grew up with and killed people. I know people, one of my very dear friends, Slim Scanlon, who is no longer with us, but he was a professional thief and a drug dealer. And like I have often said, when he was still with us, if I got arrested in China and clapped in jail, and I had one phone call, I'd call Slim Scanlon, and I damn well know he would get on a plane or a boat or whatever it took, and he would come and get me out. If Slim was your, that's the kind of person he was. And those kinds of people, when you come from that kind of background, the people you stand with, they got your back, and you better have theirs. So I know those people, but I also know the heads of, Sean Bailey, who's the head of production at Disney right now,
right.
is a friend of mine, and we work together. Through my friend George Kondo, the painter who I made a documentary about, we were hanging around at Princess Caroline's house in Monaco. So, I've hung around with these people and these people, and so I know how people behave,
Right, but even by that standard, though, the characters in Henry are a good bit lower.
Yes, true. I didn't have any, people that were like, to the best of my knowledge, I never hung around with a serial killer.
I'm curious about the degree to which you choose a project based on your point of view about class, which comes through quite clearly in your films, or whether that's something that you find and excavate in the material.
Well, again, when you in academia, you tend to look at things that we get to choose. Like I say, not many people, even if. I know this. I was working for Marty Scorsese when he wound up doing Cape Fear, and I know the practical considerations that caused him to do that picture. He had another picture that he was going to make, a David Mamet script rewrite of High and Low, that at the last minute fell apart, and he wanted to work, and there was Cape Fear. And so he took, it was a chance for him to work with De Niro again, which he hadn't for some time, because De Niro was already committed. And Spielberg was the producer, and it was a Spielberg project, and he and Spielberg were great friends. And so, so Wild Things came about. Again, you always need a job, and what job can you get? I needed to, at that point, I needed to make a commercial film, to just be viable in the marketplace. So Wild Things came along, and I read it, and I go, the thing I love about this script is, as crazy as it is, I can see it actually happening. And once I can imagine something being really happening, then I know how to direct it. And so even though it was a really insane story, I go, but in South Florida, this could happen. But it wasn't like I'm looking for this particular type, I didn't write Wild Things. I can go home, I've got stacks of things I've written, a few of which have ever been produced. But, the idea that you can get your dream, again, everyone, the biggest filmmakers, well, this was my dream project. And usually those projects fail.
So one thing that runs throughout a lot of your work, but it doesn't neatly fit genre is that your films are very, very funny, but they don't necessarily get qualified as comedies. And particularly in Henry, there was a sort of voice that you and Richard Fire worked up that you referred to as the poetics of idiocy. And I'm curious about your take on the humor in all of this darker material, but particularly in the kind of pitch black material of this movie.
Well, it was just impossible not to. I mean, you're sitting. Richard Fire was really funny, and I do miss him. We had a lot of fun writing Henry, I have to say, and we worked on other projects, none of which ever got made. Unfortunately, it's too bad. But
Except The Borrower.
well, that was somebody else's script that I was allowed to bring Richard in on, and we that was an experience. But working with Richard was always, the best people are always crazy, and Richard was really crazy and fun and bright, and also it's just I enjoy humor. I enjoy when I'm writing. Like I say, I always wind up making things funny to amuse myself while I'm sitting there alone. So yeah, there's a lot of comedy woven throughout the and it's funny going to see Mad Dog and Glory. Now people call it a comedy, and it wasn't. We didn't consider it that we were making a comedy when we were making it.
Well, the publicity at the time was that Bill Murray was going to do this series.
Marketing got a hold of it, and there is, what I learned the hard way was, if you're working for the studios, you probably should do, you better find you better slot a genre. Because the marketing department works off templates, and they know how to do a love story or a buddy story or an action adventure or a cop movie or what have you. So what's Mad Dog and Glory? Well, is it a cop movie? Well, it's about a cop, but not really a cop movie. Is it a love story? Well, there's a love story in there, but it's not a love story. Is it a buddy movie? Well, in its way, it's kind of a buddy movie, but it's just, what do they call them? Tweeners. The studios come up with these horrible expressions that make it's like fingernails on a blackboard. And I don't know if that's still in use, but it's a tweener. It doesn't, it's between this genre and that genre. Then they don't know how to market it. But the marketing department is always, well, what do we have to sell? Well, we've got Bob De Niro playing a wimpy guy. Nobody, what are we going to do with that? They want to see the Raging Bull. They want to see Bob De Niro, the gangster. So they figured the thing they had most to sell was Bill Murray. And they took out, like the scene where he bangs his head on the pole, and they try to make it, this is a Bill Murray comedy. And that's another, I'm getting ready to teach at the Second City's new film school. So I showed the class, the first year's class, that they just started this school in August. And showed Mad Dog and Glory, and I hadn't seen it for years. And it's the strangest movie. And Bill Murray's performance is sometimes funny, but sometimes incredibly scary. When you go to the bottom of Bill Murray's soul, there's a dark spot down there. And man, he's scary. So, but like I say, now when I see, on Facebook and stuff, and it shows up, this is a hilarious comedy, it's blah, blah, blah. And Richard Price, who wrote it, is a very funny guy, but in a very dour, deadpan way.
Well, one thing too about some of the, not all of it, but some of the comedy in your work is that it's more about how the story unfolds and then how a character reacts to it, rather than it is about a joke or a set piece or a build up to a comic reaction.
It's a kind of, again, it's not what you'd call it. It's funny how words or expressions evolve to where they no longer mean what they started out to mean. But it's like, if you watch TV comedy, it's called sitcom.
Right.
But it comes from situation comedy because it's not the jokes, it's not jokey, it's not slapstick, but there is something about the situation that's funny. And I made a movie a number of years ago called Speaking of Sex, where it was a comedy, flat out. So never having made that type of comedy, it's like, okay, we're making a comedy, let's reach for that comedy. And I learned it very difficult, no, you play it straight, and the situation is funny. It's from being removed and seeing what they don't see that it's funny, but don't play the comedy because then you kill it.
Let's talk about video in Henry. On the one hand, I think you have this particularly notorious and horrific sequence of the film shot on video, and it's often talked about as being kind of prescient. What had been your experience with making video before this?
Well, when I was working in the advertising business, it's funny how when we're young we want to be I don't know, I'm speaking for myself, but I think often you want the new thing. You know, I went to the Institute of Holography here. The holography is going to be the new thing, and it sort of didn't really pan out. But video, you know, portable, I mean, Namjoon Paik, video was also a tool for fine art. But the idea that, you know, you could have a Porta-Pack camera and you could have it, you know, you didn't have to buy film because I couldn't afford film, no one I knew. And you could go out and you could, you know, make films with video, but video itself was cheap. So it was liberating in many ways. And so I was sort of a proponent of video will replace film. Film is dead. I think, what was 1957 or 1950? I think 57 Ampex came up with the first 2-inch reel-to-reel. And I watched a lot of TV as a kid. So when you're watching a movie, it's film. You know, most of the TV series were shot on film. But when you watch the news and you watch certain things, it was either live, which is the same as you look at a TV screen, looks identical to a video playback of that same event. So it had a different quality. Film to me I loved it. It's beautiful, much more beautiful than video. But it always represents a distance in time. Film was shot an hour ago, a week ago. Video is this instant. Even if it is a tape playback, it has the quality of being this instant. It has a realism that film does not have, to me. Film is like oil paint. It's beautiful. And it's, you know, you're shining light through a transparency. Video is not so beautiful, but it's now. And that's why shooting the murderers on video, to me, using the actual, you know, video image rather than the 16 millimeter image, it gave it an immediate realism that the film itself doesn't have. And it made it more horrific.
Yeah, it's a really big shift in the tone to a darker world, even in a movie that's already very dark. And the 16 millimeter film is grittier than 35 would be, you know, of the same material, but then it goes that much worse all of a sudden.
Yeah, it's more, to me, it's just like more immediate. It's real in a way that the film itself can't be.
Well, you know, that moment is a big moment of transgression in the film, and I think a lot of your work has you know, dances with transgression to, you know, various degrees. You know, sometimes like in Henry, it's more blunt and in your face, and sometimes it's more subtle. But there are a number of different kinds of transgression, and this is one of those moments in the film where we shift into something where it cannot any longer be funny or entertaining or even heightened kind of excitement, but it's just it's a bit too much. And I'm curious about your take on how transgression functions in terms of character and drama in your films.
Well, I don't know how it functions in that sense, but I would just, as you were talking, I was thinking about the transgression. And to me, it comes from my love of art. And all the great artists, you know, there were, the whole idea of art, well, you can't do that. And if I'm an artist, I go, watch me. You know, there's a boundary here and you can't cross it. It's like, that's your job as an artist, to cross that boundary. As I often tell people, I didn't go to film school, I went to art school. And, you know, I mean, again, Demoiselle d'Avignon, Picasso's, I mean, he didn't show that to anybody for 7 years after he did it, because it made people, you know, violent when they saw it. It's like, you can't do that, you know. Stravinsky, which, I don't know, it was Rite of Spring or something, there was a riot the first time it was performed, you know. You break, that's your job, to transgress the boundaries. That's the artist's responsibility.
Well, and back to the comedy, I feel like that's one of the key ways that you transgress in your films. You know, whether turning on or off the comedy faucet and making us complicit by, you know, laughing with or at the characters at various points.
Yeah, I try not to, you know, laugh at them. I mean, you sort of do, but you sort of, you know, sympathy for the devil. You sort of have to. You know, Richard Fire was very. Richard Fire taught me a lot because he came out of the theater and you know, was a man of the theater. And you've got to love your characters to some degree or another. Otis was pretty hard to love, but but Henry had his good points. He was better than Otis, at least. So,
Well, right, and that's a major point of transgression because you start with this guy who's.
but as I say, Tommy Tolles, that's almost a clown role he's playing. I mean, he's playing a comedic role actually. As vile as his character is, Tommy was a great clown, and really funny. And that's what he's doing. He's playing a clown.
Let's look back a little bit to class concerns because those come through in Henry in a particular way. Your own experience being, part of that upper, lower, middle class, but the class of these characters is something far below that. But then you're showing a lot of, but from the bottom, you show a lot of kind of fascinating class relationships as much as possible within this story. In their moves throughout the film. From the kind of gutter to the suburbs.
Sounds like the progression of the people that I grew up with. Well, it probably. My father had a favorite expression of that I really liked, and whenever anyone was put forward as from a high, well, they are, they live in Flossmoor, and they put, or this one, they're well-to-do, and they're this, and they're. My father always, but do you know so and so? He's my father always goes, oh yeah, where does he tend bar? I mean, it was like, this is America. We're as good as anybody, and I also think that comes from Scotland. And my grandfather, you just don't ever bow to anyone. You're as good as anyone, and anyone thinks differently, it's their problem. Like, again, my father was, if you're an American, you root for the underdog, always. That's who you are. That's who we are as a nation. And it was just, and I sort of carry that with me.
Maybe Henry's the ultimate underdog.
Yeah, sort of.
The farthest
Yeah,
under.
it's about as low as you can get.